January 17, 1943. Rechlin Airfield, Brandenburg, Germany. The winter sun hung low over the frozen tarmac, casting long shadows across the concrete as a team of Luftwaffe engineers approached the captured machine with the quiet reverence usually reserved for religious relics. Their breath formed pale clouds in the bitter cold. The aircraft before them was enormous, a 4-engine heavy bomber, its olive-drab paint scarred by flak damage and streaked with oil. Bullet holes punctured the fuselage like constellations. One propeller blade was twisted, frozen mid-rotation. This was a Boeing B-17F Flying Fortress, serial number 425277, forced down over occupied France 3 weeks earlier after a raid on the submarine pens at Saint-Nazaire. The crew had survived, now prisoners. But the machine had become something else entirely. A puzzle, a warning. A window into an industrial philosophy that German military doctrine had not fully comprehended, until fragments of it began falling from the sky over the Reich. Ober-Ingenieur Hans Müller stepped forward first, his leather portfolio clutched against his chest. He had spent 18 months analyzing wreckage from downed American bombers, cataloging components, measuring tolerances, photographing assemblies. But this was different. This was an intact specimen, relatively undamaged, its systems still functional enough to study in operation. Müller circled the aircraft slowly, his eyes tracing the lines of the airframe, the rivets, the gun positions bristling from nearly every angle. 9 defensive positions, 9. He counted them again to be certain. Nose, tail, dorsal, ventral. 2 waist positions, 2 cheek guns, 1 more in the radio compartment. The numbers didn't make sense from a weight perspective. Each gun meant crew, ammunition, turret mechanisms, armor plating, hydraulic systems. The engineering trade-offs should have been prohibitive. Yet here it stood, proof that American designers had made choices German engineers would have considered wasteful. Excessive, perhaps even irrational. But then, Müller reminded himself, German fighters had been vanishing. The losses had begun gradually in late 1942, dismissed at first as operational attrition, the expected cost of intercepting heavy bomber formations at altitude. But by the winter of 1943, the pattern had become undeniable. Experienced pilots were not returning from missions. Entire Staffeln reported casualties that exceeded projections. FW-190s and Bf-109s, the backbone of the Reich's air defense, were being shot down at rates that confounded tactical analysis. Not by enemy fighters, those encounters were expected, understood, trained for. No, these losses occurred during bomber intercepts, during what should have been the hunter's most decisive moments, the killing passes at close range. The German fighters were themselves being killed. The High Command wanted answers. Reichsmarschall Göring had personally demanded an explanation. How could the best fighter pilots in the world, flying the most advanced interceptors in service, suffer such losses against formations of heavy bombers? Bombers were supposed to be vulnerable, slow, cumbersome targets. The doctrine was clear. Approach from the rear quarter. Close to effective range, deliver a concentrated burst. Breakaway. Simple. Proven. Deadly. Except the Americans had changed the equation. Müller opened his portfolio and withdrew a file stamped with red classifications. Inside were reports from surviving pilots, technical intelligence briefs, gun camera footage analysis, even testimony from Luftwaffe ground crews who had recovered wreckage of both American bombers and German fighters shot down in the same engagements. The accounts shared a common thread of surprise, of encountering something unexpected. One Oberleutnant had described his approach on a B-17 formation as flying into a steel rain. Another reported that the volume of defensive fire was unlike anything experienced against British bombers. A third stated simply that he had underestimated the Americans, and his wingman had paid the price. But testimonies were subjective, colored by stress and survival. Müller needed objective data. He needed to understand the machinery. He approached the dorsal turret first, the twin 50s pointing skyward like accusing fingers. The turret housing was surprisingly compact given the firepower it contained. 2 Browning M2 machine guns, each capable of firing up to 850 rounds per minute, 50 caliber ammunition, 12.7 by 99 millimeters, each round carrying enough kinetic energy to punch through aircraft aluminum at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters. Müller ran his gloved hand along the gun barrels, still cold as the winter air. The engineering was elegant in its brutality. where German defensive armament on bombers tended toward lighter calibers, 7.92mm machine guns, occasionally 13mm heavy machine guns, the Americans had standardized on weapons that blurred the line between defensive and offensive capability. These were not deterrents. These were man-killers, aircraft killers, designed to destroy rather than discourage. The turret mechanism itself revealed another layer of American thinking. It rotated smoothly on ball bearings manufactured to tolerances that impressed even Muller's exacting standards. The optical gun sight was simple but effective, and the entire assembly could traverse 360 degrees with minimal lag. A gunner positioned here commanded the entire upper hemisphere of the aircraft. No blind spots above, no safe approach from altitude. German tactical doctrine had long favored diving attacks from above, using altitude advantage and gravity to build speed for the firing pass. This turret invalidated that approach. Any fighter diving on a B-17 would present itself as a target to this position for the entire duration of its attack run. Muller made notes, his handwriting cramped but precise. He moved aft toward the tail gun position, climbing carefully along the narrow catwalk inside the fuselage. The interior of the bomber was cramped, utilitarian, stripped of anything resembling comfort. Bare metal, exposed ribs, bundles of cables and hydraulic lines running like mechanical intestines. The Americans had not wasted weight on amenities. Every kilogram was accounted for. Every component served a function. This was not a machine built by romantics or idealists. This was engineering in service of industrial warfare. The tailgun position was even more cramped than Muller had imagined. Barely enough space for a man to kneel, surrounded by the twin 50s and their ammunition feeds. Frozen condensation still clung to the interior surfaces. He imagined the gunner who had manned this position, isolated at the extreme rear of the aircraft, the loneliest position in the crew, watching enemy fighters materialize out of the sky behind him. How many had he faced? How many had he killed? The gun mechanisms here were identical to the dorsal turret. The same Browning M2s, the same ammunition, the same rate of fire, standardization. Mueller recognized it as a principle American industry excelled at: interchangeable parts, common components, simplified logistics. German engineering often prized specialization, bespoke solutions tailored to specific problems. The Americans had chosen a different path: make one thing that works, then make 10,000 of them exactly the same. This tail position covered the entire rear approach, the traditional attack vector for fighter intercepts. Any pilot attempting the textbook rear quarter attack would fly directly into this gun's field of fire. And unlike the smaller caliber weapons on German bombers, these 50s had the range and power to kill at distances where the fighter's own guns were still ineffective. Muller had read reports of fighters being destroyed at ranges of 600, 700, even 800 meters. At those distances, the fighter pilot would barely have begun lining up his shot. But the bomber gunner, sitting in a stable platform, defending a fixed position, only needed to track the approaching fighter and fire. The mathematics favored the defender. He descended back through the fuselage, pausing at each gun position. The waist guns, another pair of 50s, one on each side of the fuselage, positioned to cover the beam approaches. These were manually operated, aimed by gunners standing in the slipstream exposed to cold and wind and fear. But they commanded overlapping fields of fire, creating a crossfire zone along the bomber's flanks. Any fighter attempting a beam attack would be engaged by both guns simultaneously. More mathematics, more overlapping kill zones. The ball turret beneath the aircraft was perhaps the most ingenious and most claustrophobic position of all. Muller had seen photographs but had never examined one in person. It was a sphere of armor and plexiglass suspended beneath the fuselage, barely large enough to contain a crouched human and two more Browning M2s. The gunner would be curled in a fetal position, rotating with the turret, looking down at the earth passing below or up at enemy fighters diving from above. This position covered the entire lower hemisphere, eliminating any safe approach from below. German pilots had learned to attack British bombers from beneath, where defensive armament was often lightest. The ball turret ended that tactic. There was no safe approach from below a B-17. Muller counted ammunition supplies at each position, calculating loadouts and firing durations. The numbers were staggering. Each gun position carried between 500 and 600 rounds per gun. 9 positions, most with twin guns, some with single guns. Total defensive armament, 13 Browning M2 machine guns. Total ammunition load, approximately 9,000 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition. If all guns fired simultaneously, the B-17 could sustain defensive fire for roughly 90 seconds before exhausting its ammunition. But guns were rarely fired all at once. Gunners conserved ammunition, fired in bursts aimed carefully. In practice, a B-17 could maintain defensive fire for the duration of most fighter engagements. More importantly, Muller realized, the gunners didn't need to destroy every attacking fighter. They only needed to disrupt attack runs, force fighters to break off early, make the approach costly and dangerous. The mere presence of this much defensive firepower altered the tactical equation. Luftwaffe pilots were brave, well-trained, experienced. But they were not suicidal. Faced with this volume of defensive fire, even the most aggressive pilot would hesitate, would recalculate, would question whether the approach angle was safe, whether the speed was sufficient, whether the odds favored survival. And that hesitation, Muller understood, was itself a victory for the bomber. He stepped back outside into the cold, circling the aircraft again, seeing it now not as a machine but as a philosophy made tangible. The B-17 was not designed to evade. It could not outrun fighters, could not outmaneuver interceptors, could not hide. Instead, it was designed to absorb punishment and return it. The defensive armament was not an afterthought or a compromise. It was central to the aircraft's doctrine. Bombers would fly in formation, each aircraft covering its neighbors, creating interlocking fields of fire that transformed individual aircraft into elements of a larger defensive system. A combat box formation of 18 B-17s represented 234 machine guns, all firing 50 caliber ammunition, all covering overlapping sectors. Attacking such a formation was not like attacking 18 separate bombers. It was like flying into a mobile fortress, a sky castle bristling with guns, where every approach vector was covered, every altitude contested, every attack met with massed defensive fire. German bomber doctrine had evolved differently. The Luftwaffe's heavy bombers, the He-111, the Ju-88, the Do-217, were designed for tactical support, for battlefield interdiction, for precision strikes on specific targets. They operated with fighter escort when possible, and their defensive armament was adequate for occasional encounters with enemy fighters. But they were not expected to fight their way through contested airspace alone. The American doctrine was fundamentally different. These bombers were strategic weapons designed to penetrate deep into enemy territory, to strike industrial targets hundreds of kilometers from friendly fighters, to operate in an environment where they would be continuously engaged by enemy interceptors. The defensive armament reflected that mission profile. These bombers were built to fight. Muller's team arrived, a dozen engineers and armament specialists, each assigned to study specific systems. They spread through the aircraft like surgeons dissecting a complex organism, photographing components, measuring assemblies, testing mechanisms. One team focused on the turret drives, analyzing the hydraulic systems and electrical controls. Another examined the ammunition feeds, noting the belt links and storage configurations. A third studied the gun mounts, the recoil mechanisms, the cooling systems. By evening, preliminary reports began to circulate. The findings were consistent. American manufacturing quality was exceptional, tolerances tight, materials high grade. But more disturbing than the quality was the quantity. Intelligence estimates suggested that Boeing, Douglas, and other American manufacturers were producing heavy bombers at rates that exceeded Germany's entire bomber production. Thousands of B-17s and B-24s were rolling off assembly lines in Seattle, California, Texas. Each aircraft represented 13 machine guns, 9,000 rounds of ammunition, armor plating, self-sealing fuel tanks, redundant systems. Multiply that by hundreds of bombers arriving in England each month, and the arithmetic became nightmarish. The Americans were not just building an air force, they were building an industrial avalanche. Mueller reviewed a classified intelligence summary that evening in his quarters, a converted barracks heated by a struggling coal stove. The report detailed American industrial capacity, factory outputs, supply chain logistics. The numbers seemed exaggerated, almost fantastical. The United States was producing more military aircraft in a single month than Germany produced in a quarter. American factories operated around the clock, 3 shifts, 7 days a week. Workforce included women, minorities, workers previously considered unsuitable for precision manufacturing. Yet quality remained high. Standardization allowed semi-skilled workers to assemble complex systems using jigs, templates, prefabricated components. German manufacturing still relied heavily on skilled craftsmen, artisans who took pride in bespoke solutions. It was a philosophy that produced excellence in individual items, but could not scale to match industrial mass production. The defensive armament of the B-17 was emblematic of this difference. Each Browning M2 was manufactured to identical specifications, interchangeable with every other M2 in service. Parts could be swapped between guns without fitting or adjustment. Ammunition was standardized. Every .50 caliber round, regardless of where it was manufactured, would function in any M2. This standardization extended to the turrets, the mounts, the sights, the ammunition feeds. An armorer trained on one B-17 could service any B-17. A gunner could move between aircraft without retraining. The system was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its scalability. But Muller's task was not to marvel at American industry. His task was to find weaknesses, to identify vulnerabilities that Luftwaffe fighters could exploit. He returned to the problem methodically, analyzing fields of fire, calculating approach vectors, identifying gaps in coverage. The B-17's defensive armament, as formidable as it was, had limitations. The nose was relatively weakly defended. Only 2 cheek guns and a handheld gun in the nose cone. A head-on attack, directly into the bomber's forward hemisphere, would expose the fighter to the least amount of defensive fire, but it required nerve. A head-on attack meant flying directly at a closing speed of over 800 kilometers per hour, with only seconds to aim, fire, and break away. The margin for error was non-existent. A slight miscalculation meant collision, and even the reduced defensive fire from the nose guns was still lethal. Those were still .50 caliber weapons, still capable of killing a fighter with a single burst. Muller drafted his recommendations carefully. Head-on attacks, he concluded, offered the best chance of success, but they required exceptional piloting skill and iron discipline. Pilots would need specialized training, practice runs, simulated approaches. Alternatively, standoff attacks using rockets or heavy cannon might allow fighters to engage bombers from beyond defensive gun range. The Luftwaffe was already experimenting with 21 cm rockets and 30 mm cannon, weapons with sufficient hitting power to destroy a heavy bomber with a handful of rounds. But these weapons were still developmental, unreliable, difficult to aim. The fundamental problem, Muller realized, was that the Americans had shifted the terms of engagement. They had turned their vulnerability, the bomber's inability to evade, into a strength by making the bomber's interior space into a weapons platform. Every cubic meter of fuselage was leveraged to mount guns, store ammunition, position gunners. The aircraft was not trying to be fast or agile. It was trying to be lethal, and in that narrow objective it succeeded brilliantly. Over the following weeks, more captured B-17s arrived at Rechlin and other testing facilities. Each was studied, dissected, analyzed. Luftwaffe pilots were briefed on the findings, shown diagrams of fields of fire, taught to recognize dead zones and approach vectors. Tactics evolved, adapted to the threat. Some fighter units began specializing in head-on attacks, diving out of the sun, firing concentrated bursts, breaking away before the bombers could react. Others experimented with massed attacks, multiple fighters converging simultaneously from different angles, attempting to saturate the defensive guns. Still others focused on stragglers, damaged bombers that had fallen out of formation, that no longer benefited from the mutual support of the combat box. But the losses continued. The American bomber offensive intensified through 1943. Formations grew larger, raids more frequent. Luftwaffe fighter pilots who had once spoken of bomber interceptions as opportunities for easy kills now described them as grim battles of attrition. The B-17s came in their hundreds in broad daylight, flying straight and level toward their targets, absorbing flak, weathering fighter attacks, dropping their bombs, turning for home. Some were shot down, sometimes many were shot down, but the formations continued. They always continued. For every B-17 that fell, another took its place. For every crew lost, another crew trained and deployed. The industrial output of the United States was not merely producing aircraft. It was producing a new form of warfare. one where material abundance and mass production became weapons as decisive as any gun or bomb. German pilots began to describe the experience of attacking B-17 formations with a mixture of respect and dread. The bomber boxes were nicknamed flying porcupines and steel hedgehogs. Approaching a formation meant flying through a visible wall of tracer fire, each fourth or fifth round a phosphorescent streak marking the path of the bullets. The sound was distinctive, a constant rattling thunder like hail on a tin roof as thousands of rounds per minute tore through the air. Fighters that survived attack runs often returned to base with dozens of bullet holes, control surfaces shredded, pilots wounded. Those that didn't return simply vanished, blown apart mid-air or spinning down in flames, adding to the growing roster of casualties that the Luftwaffe could not afford. Muller continued his research, but the conclusions remained consistent. The B-17's defensive armament was not a flaw to be exploited. It was a deliberate, calculated design philosophy, executed with industrial precision and backed by seemingly limitless resources. The Americans had looked at the problem of daylight strategic bombing and had solved it not with technological genius or tactical brilliance, but with straightforward engineering and overwhelming production. They had built a bomber that could fight, armed it to the teeth, manufactured it by the thousands, and sent it into the sky in formations so large that shooting them all down was not logistically possible. By the autumn of 1943, internal Luftwaffe assessments privately acknowledged what frontline pilots had known for months. The American daylight bombing campaign could not be stopped. It could be resisted, it could be challenged, losses could be inflicted, but the bomber stream would continue. The factories in the Ruhr, the refineries in Ploesti, the ball-bearing plants in Schweinfurt, all were now within reach of American heavy bombers, and all would be struck repeatedly until they were destroyed or until the Reich's fighter defenses were exhausted. The symbolic weight of this realization extended beyond tactical concerns. German propaganda had long emphasized technological superiority, the qualitative advantage of German engineering and fighting spirit over the quantitative mass of enemy forces. The narrative was appealing, even comforting. Germany might be outnumbered, but German excellence would prevail. The B-17, and the industrial system that produced it, challenged that narrative at its core. Here was an American weapon that was not inferior, not poorly made, not evidence of democratic softness or industrial inefficiency. It was effective, lethal, and available in quantities that rendered individual superiority irrelevant. Muller filed his final report in December 1943, a comprehensive technical analysis that concluded with an assessment he knew would be unwelcome. The B-17's defensive armament represented a category of problem that could not be solved with existing resources. Countering it would require either technological breakthroughs, jet fighters, guided missiles, weapons systems that did not yet exist in operational form, or acceptance that the American bomber offensive would continue until its objectives were achieved or until its political will was exhausted. The report was classified, circulated among senior staff, and largely ignored. The war continued. The bombers continued. But for those who had studied the machines, who had walked through their interiors and measured their guns and calculated their ammunition loads, a different understanding had taken root. The B-17 was not just a bomber. It was a message written in aluminum and steel, delivered at 25,000 feet. The message was simple. American industrial capacity was vast enough to absorb losses and continue production. American doctrine was flexible enough to adapt to challenges and evolve tactics. American resolve was strong enough to send young men into defended airspace, day after day, knowing that some would not return, and to continue sending them until the objective was achieved. The defensive guns of the B-17, those 13 Browning M2s, those 9,000 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition, were not merely weapons. They were symbols of a particular kind of power, one that did not rely on individual heroism or technological mystique, but on systemic capability and industrial depth. It was the power to manufacture solutions to problems, to produce enough of a working design that quantity became quality, to replace losses faster than the enemy could inflict them. German engineers had studied the B-17's defensive guns and realized why their fighters kept vanishing mid-air. The answer was not a secret or a mystery. It was plainly visible in every turret, every ammunition belt, every gun mount. The Americans had built a bomber that fought back, armed it with weapons that could kill fighters at defensive ranges, produced it in numbers that made attrition warfare unwinnable for the defender, and deployed it with a doctrine that emphasized mutual support and concentrated firepower. The fighters vanished because they were flying into a system designed to destroy them, and because the mathematics of that system, more guns, more ammunition, more bombers, more crews, favored the attacker. The Luftwaffe's tactical excellence, its experienced pilots, its advanced fighters were all real. But they were insufficient against an opponent who could afford to lose 100 bombers and return with 200, who could lose 1,000 crewmen and train 2,000 more, who could absorb any single defeat and continue the offensive without pause. In the frozen winter of 1943, standing on the tarmac at Rechlin beside a captured B-17, Muller had understood this truth. It was visible in the machine before him, in every rivet and gun barrel and armor plate. The Americans had not built a perfect bomber. They had built a sufficient bomber, and they had built enough of them. That was the lesson the defensive guns taught. That was why the fighters vanished. The war would continue for another year and a half. More fighters would be lost. More bombers would fall. The skies over Germany would fill with contrails and smoke, with falling men and burning machines. Thousands would die on both sides, statistics in a calculus of attrition that neither side could escape. But the outcome, for those who understood the implications of those 13 guns and 9,000 rounds, was no longer in doubt. The B-17 Flying Fortress, with its bristling defensive armament, its redundant systems, its utilitarian design, represented a form of warfare that industrial democracies waged with particular effectiveness. Warfare as production problem, combat as logistics exercise, victory as the inevitable result of superior manufacturing capacity sustained over time. It was not romantic. It was not glorious. It was the kind of warfare that accountants and engineers could appreciate, where spreadsheets and factory output determined outcomes as surely as courage or skill. The Germans had studied the defensive guns and learned a lesson they did not want to learn, that the war would not be won by the side with the best planes or the bravest pilots, but by the side with the most planes and the ability to keep producing them. The B-17's guns had taught that lesson at ranges of 600 meters in bursts of 50 caliber fire to Luftwaffe fighters that vanished in flames over the Reich. Years later, after the war, surviving Luftwaffe pilots would sometimes speak of the B-17 with a kind of grudging respect. They would remember the formations, the guns, the relentlessness of the bomber offensive. Some would recall specific encounters, moments when they watched their wingman explode under defensive fire, or when they themselves were hit, controls shot away, engine burning, the long terrifying glide down to earth. Others would simply shake their heads and observe that attacking the Americans was different from attacking the British, that the B-17 was a hard target, that respect for its defensive firepower was not weakness but wisdom. The captured B-17 at Rechlin was eventually scrapped, its components distributed to research facilities, its secrets extracted and catalogued, but the knowledge it imparted, the understanding of what those defensive guns represented, remained. It was a knowledge that extended beyond engineering specifications or tactical analysis. It was an understanding of how wars are won, not always by the boldest or the bravest, but sometimes by the most prepared, the most productive, the most capable of sustaining effort over time until the objective is achieved and the enemy is exhausted. The defensive guns of the B-17 Flying Fortress were tools of war, instruments of violence, devices designed to kill men in the sky. But they were also, in their way, instruments of a broader truth, that industrial capacity matters, that production depth matters, that the ability to manufacture solutions and deploy them at scale is itself a form of power. The German fighters vanished mid-air because they encountered that power, concentrated in 13 machine guns and 9,000 rounds of ammunition, repeated across hundreds of bombers, sustained across thousands of missions, until the simple arithmetic of attrition could no longer be denied. In the end, the guns did not win the war. No single weapon wins wars, but they were part of the system that won, part of the industrial and doctrinal and logistical framework that allowed the United States and its allies to project power across oceans, to strike targets deep in enemy territory, to sustain losses and continue operations, to wear down defenses through sheer persistence, The B-17's defensive armament was a piece of that framework, a visible manifestation of the principles that underlay it. Hans Muller survived the war. He returned to engineering, working in civilian industry, designing machinery that built things rather than destroyed them. But he never forgot the winter day in 1943 when he stood beside a captured B-17 and counted its guns and understood, with the clarity that only comes from direct observation, why the fighters were vanishing. The knowledge was technical, measurable, expressed in calibers and rates of fire and ammunition loads, but its implications were profound. A window into how power is constructed and wielded, how wars are fought and won, how nations translate industrial capacity into military outcomes. The B-17 flew its last combat missions in 1945. Many were scrapped after the war, their aluminum recycled, their guns melted down, but some were preserved, displayed in museums, silent monuments to a particular era of warfare. Visitors walk through their cramped interiors, touch the gun mounts, peer through the turret sights. Most do not fully comprehend what they are seeing. They see an old airplane, a relic, a piece of history. But for those who know the story, who understand the context, the B-17 is something more. It is a testament to what happens when industrial democracies mobilize for total war. When factories become arsenals, when production capacity becomes the ultimate weapon. The defensive guns of the B-17 taught that lesson in the skies over Europe. One burst of 50 caliber fire at a time, to an enemy that had expected victory and found instead an opponent capable of absorbing losses and returning stronger. The German fighters vanished because they flew into the teeth of that capability. And because the mathematics of industrial warfare, once the equations were fully written, favored the side with deeper factories and longer supply lines and the will to use them. This was the truth that Muller discovered. That winter day in 1943, standing in the cold beside a machine that had crossed an ocean to make war. It was a truth written in steel and aluminum, measured in calibers and rounds per minute, proven in the empty skies where German fighters had once flown and now flew no more. The B-17's guns had spoken, and their message was clear. This war would not be won by individual valor or tactical genius, but by the side that could build more, produce more, sustain more, until the other side could no longer continue. The lesson was hard, learned at the cost of thousands of lives on both sides, but it was learned. And in the learning, a new understanding of modern warfare emerged, one where industrial capacity and production depth were recognized as strategic weapons as powerful as any bomb or bullet. The B-17 Flying Fortress, with its 13 defensive machine guns and its 9,000 rounds of ammunition, was both the teacher and the lesson, a machine that fought, a symbol that endured, a truth made tangible in aluminum and steel in the empty sky where fighters once flew before they vanished into history.